broadcasting across California. California's only statewide political show. You're watching The Issue Is.
Welcome to a historic week here on The Issue Is. I'm Elex Michaelson. Of course, the big issue, the presidential race. President Trump versus Vice President Biden. At the end of this week, a few things are clear as we tape this on Friday. It is really likely that Joe Biden becomes the next president of the United States. It's also really likely that President Trump doesn't accept that reality anytime soon. So where do we go from here? What did we learn from this week? We brought together an all-star panel, some of our favorites, to talk about it. Let's introduce them right now. Carla Marinucci is one of the senior writers at Politco. She puts together the daily playbook, which I encourage you to check out every day. Brian Goldsmith is a political strategist and former journalist. He's now working mostly on the Democratic side. John Kobylt is the host of the John and Ken Show, along with Ken, on KFI AM 640 and the iHeartRadio app. Welcome to all of you. Okay, so let's start with this premise. A President-elect Biden. Carla, what does that mean? What does that mean for the people of California?
Well, I mean, Biden has said many times, I campaigned as a Democrat, but I'm going to govern as an American president. And he has said that the presidency itself is not a partisan institution. So that message right there may give some people hope. But I think in the next 2 months, we may have to look at what Trump does to throw some roadblocks in his way. He may fire some cabinet members, sign a roster of executive orders that Biden may have to undo. He may even decide to up his travel schedule around the country and ramp up the red meat base again, Alex. I think that's an issue. I think one thing we can take hope from is that both he and Mitch McConnell have a long-standing friendship. McConnell was the only Senate Republican to go to Beau Biden's funeral. They know each other. They like each other. I think that may be a starting point as the new government forms and as America moves ahead to the next chapter.
Brian?
Well, I think we're going to see two big things. One, the war against blue states will come to an end. That may include bringing back the state and local tax deduction, stopping all of these actions that are hostile to the interests of people who live in more Democratic-leaning areas. And secondly, most importantly, on COVID, we're going to have a president who follows the science and listens to the experts rather than one who waves the white flag and pretends that it doesn't exist. We have 150,000 new COVID cases today.
John.
There's nothing Biden is going to do to stop the COVID cases. A politician can't stop a virus. It's going to run its course until we get a vaccine and people get injected with the vaccine. As far as what happens in the next couple of years, I mean, 60% of the country doesn't think Biden's going to last 4 years. Probably nothing. He might be just an inconsequential, almost accidental president like Gerald Ford was, because the Republicans are going to roadblock the progressive agenda that everybody was hyperventilating over. None of that's going to happen. There's not going to be massive tax increases on the rich. There's not going to be a new Green Deal. There's not going to be massive bailouts of states and cities that wildly mismanage their money. They're not going to pack the Supreme Court. They're not going to defund the police from a federal standpoint. None of that's going to happen now. We're just going to be moping along for 2 years and see how long Biden lasts.
What an optimistic view of the future, John. Let me ask you, John, a follow-up though, because there are a lot of folks that voted for President Trump, right? And he actually outperformed the polling in most places in this country. And there's folks on the left that think that Donald Trump is the worst president of all time, that thinks that he's a liar and a criminal, and they cannot wrap their heads around how anybody could support him. Speak for those folks.
Now you're looking at almost 70 million votes. I checked today. That's more than Obama ever got in an election. More than Ronald Reagan, more than either George Bush, more than anybody, more than Clinton. He got 70 million votes. And all these people were told all those horrible things about Trump repeatedly. You had these absurd polls. I have a list here. 10 major polls. Their final poll said Trump is losing by anywhere from 8 to 12 points. Clearly, at least 70 million people don't believe all the stuff they hear about Trump, or they don't care. And that's the reality that's not going away. In fact, the progressives may have signed up now for 8 years of Trump because he's probably going to run again, and his campaign will start in 2 years. He'll agitate from now until 2022. Then he starts a campaign, and then if he wins, he'll be around till 2028. So instead of getting it over with quickly in 4 years, now there might be 8 more years of Trump in the media every day.
And Brian, for you, from the Democratic side, the president did better than expected. Democrats look like they're going to lose a lot of these competitive House seats. A lot of the most competitive Senate seats they did not win. Where do you think is some of the disconnect there on the messaging on the Democratic side?
Well, I think there's a mixed bag. On the one hand, Joe Biden won 5 to 7 million more votes when all the counting is done than Donald Trump. He will have won the most votes of any presidential candidate in American history, far more than Donald Trump, a bigger victory in the popular vote than Obama's in 12 over Romney. On the other hand, you're right, there was a surprise further down the ticket. And I think there are a number of things that we can point to. Number one, Democrats should examine our relationship with voters of color, particularly Latinos. I think some of what we're saying and doing in those communities just isn't working. Number two, I think among a lot of suburban center-right white voters, our hold on them is a little more tenuous than we expected. We can't just be against Donald Trump. Number three, on the economy, I think we need to make a stronger and more assertive case about how our policies will make people's lives better. We can't go into a presidential election again, particularly under these circumstances, where the Republican candidate has a significant advantage on the economy.
And Carla, it appears that COVID also may have broken both ways. Obviously, people are frustrated with the fact that we have over 200,000 dead Americans, but there's also a lot of frustration here in California from Democrats who are angry that the lockdowns have lasted as long as they have and have hurt businesses as much as they have as well.
That's true, Alex. And of course, we just hit some record numbers in the last 2 days, again, on COVID. So I disagree respectfully to John that this is not going to be something that Biden is going to tackle at all. That is, his messaging, I think, is going to be very, very important as we go forward right away. But I also think, look, both parties have to take a long and hard look at the way they have messaged and to the American people. The Republican Party, yes, there's going to be a faction, the MAGA group, that goes out and tries to make sure that red meat message is still strong and that Trump message is still strong. But the party itself has to confront the demographic changes in this country. We saw it in Arizona. We saw it in Nevada. We saw it in Georgia, some of the lost ground that they've made. And here in California, more than any other place, the Republican Party has seen the effects of that messaging and that failure to reach out. So the Democrats, on the other hand, have got to work with the centrist groups. Look, they've lost labor. They've lost a lot of those rank and file working class folks that have gone to the Republican Party. They got to figure out how to get that back. I got to say, in terms of the Biden administration, looking at how California might be affected, I think that is something we really want to watch. California has a huge talent pool. It's the home to Kamala Harris. I think many people from California are likely to get tapped into the Biden administration, and we could see California have a major footprint going forward in Joe Biden's administration. So that is something to watch as well.
Carla and John, you both have kind of assumed that the Republicans are going to have the Senate majority, and that is the most likely scenario. But there is a possibility that the Democrats win both of these runoffs in Georgia. Brian, how likely is that possibility? And if you were working on those campaigns, what would the message be for the Ossoff campaign and the Warnock campaign?
The message is, if you want to preserve pre-existing conditions protection, if you want to get economic relief under COVID, if you want to listen to Dr. Fauci instead of talk radio hosts, you need allies of President Biden and not enemies in Washington. I would embrace the nationalization of the race because it's unavoidable. And I would talk about the issues where Democrats are on the right side in Georgia and Republicans are on the wrong side.
John, your thoughts on that race?
Probably the Republicans win both. The only reason one of the races turned out with the Democratic leader is there were two strong Republican candidates. Those votes will coalesce. And I think in the Purdue race, he was, what, a tenth of a point short of a majority? It's not hard for him to push a little over 50 in a one-on-one battle. So it's probably going to go both ways. Again, everyone's missing. 70 million people like Trump, and they like his policy, and they like what he emphasized. They are not racist, sexist, xenophobic, homophobic. They're not, and they're sick of being called names and being abused. And if the Democrats go back to that, they're never going to get the power that they're looking for. People don't understand that they felt Trump was this superhero fighting back against every idiot in the media and academia and politics who is constantly calling them names and assigning them characteristics that they do not have.
All right, we got a lot more to talk about in terms of California issues. We had a whole lot of ballot measures, hundreds of millions of dollars spent on them. How did it go? We'll talk about that when we come back. But as we go to break, a little music just recorded by John Legend, and it was a tribute to a legend of Georgia.
Georgia, oh Georgia, the whole day through.
This is something he recorded right after Georgia flipped into the Biden column. We'll see if it remains that way when the recounts are done. But now there'll be so much attention, of course, on Georgia as the recount, or as the Senate race there continues.
Georgia, oh Georgia, a song of you.
Baby, you can drive my car. Of course, we're listening to the Beatles. Speaking of driving my car, Proposition 22. This was a measure put on the ballot by Uber and Lyft. They spent over $200 million to try to keep their drivers as independent contractors. And at the end of the day, California voters sided with them. Let's talk about that and more with our panel this week. Carla Marinucci of Politco, a political strategist, Brian Goldsmith, and John Kobylt from the John and Ken Show. Brian, let's start with you because you actually do some consulting work with Lyft. You helped work on this, and congratulations on it passing. What do you think is the big takeaway? It's good when you have $200 million to spend?
Well, you know, a lot of people have spent a lot of money in California politics and have lost. I mean, Meg Whitman spent about the same amount of money to lose the governor's race 10 years ago. I would say from the very beginning, what voters were interested in on this issue was not what the politicians thought, it was what the drivers thought. And the drivers have been very consistent. They want to keep their independence, the ability to drive when and where and how they choose, and add portable benefits. And in fact, the margin of victory was significantly bigger than we expected.
And John, they also overly rejected affirmative action. This was Prop 16 put on the ballot. It seems on this one, the legislature was ahead of where the voters are.
Well, the voters were at this point 25 years ago,
right,
when the original proposition passed. Most people believe that the color of your skin or your ethnicity should have nothing to do with whether you get admitted into a university or get hired or get a contract with the government.
Let's talk as well, Carla, about Proposition 15. This really gets to the heart of the holy grail of all California propositions, which is Proposition 13, of course, which was regulations on taxes for housing way back in the day. This was about regulations for commercial real estate. Some people thought it was a slippery slope to more regulations for your own property taxes if you live at a house. What did you make of the way this all came down?
You know, Alex, I think this issue, as well as the cash bail issue, shows that California is maybe not as solidly blue as people think. There is a definite purple cast. Californians are conflicted in some things. But on the other hand, on local issues, when it came to local school and tax issues, for instance, in the Bay Area, 13 school districts, they checked the yes box on those. On criminal justice, let's remember George Gascon, the progressive candidate in the DA's race in L.A., came out ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sympathetic to the idea of tax reform, but I think it's got to be coupled with spending reform so that voters can be confident that the money is going to go to the right places, to schools and communities, and not to special interests and pensions.
All right, well, up next, what could be the next biggest question in all of California politics: who is going to be the next senator from California? Assuming, of course, that we have a Vice President Kamala Harris. As we go to break, some music from Taylor Swift. This was a song that she put out to encourage voting. Taylor Swift has come out on the Democratic side pretty hardcore this past year. A reminder, if you want to get more information about our show, log on to our website, theissueisshow.com. You can also send us an email, theissueis@foxtv.com, and listen to our podcast there as well. We'll be right back.
We're going to be okay. We're going to be okay. I promise.
I'm curious if anybody has already started to pitch themselves as a replacement to you.
Well, you may be the only one that hasn't, unless you just did. And that is only slight exaggeration.
So I'll add Fernando Valenzuela.
Yeah.
We just hung out with him. He didn't mention it, which was a breakthrough. The two of you.
By the way, if you're offering, I'll take it.
so that leaves Fernando as the only guy who hasn't asked.
It's good. This week, Fernando Valenzuela actually asked to be the senator from California. No, I'm kidding. That was us talking last week with Governor Gavin Newsom about what will be the biggest issue in California politics for a whole lot of ambitious people who don't get this opportunity very often, the race to potentially replace Kamala Harris in the United States Senate. All of the power rests in one man, John Kobylt's favorite, the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, who now has this opportunity to make this pick. We are joined by John Kobylt from KFI, political strategist, Brian Goldsmith, and Carla Marinucci of Politco. Okay, John, let's start with you. Who do you think he's going to pick?
I have no idea. And he could probably pick any random person off the streets of San Francisco, and they would vote exactly the same way Kamala Harris would have voted. So I wonder if it even matters. They vote in lockstep largely in the Senate.
Well, to John's point, it's not just how you vote. It's also what you do. Who can put together bipartisan coalitions? Who knows how to write legislation? Who can actually be effective on behalf of the people of this state? Personally, I'd be for Karen Bass because she's a master legislator. I think she would do an outstanding job. But if she wants to stay in the House to potentially become Speaker one day, which I'm also for, I think Alex Padilla, who's probably the front runner, would be a good choice as well. And historic, the first Latino senator.
I talked to Gavin Newsom this week on it. He says he doesn't wish his worst enemy to have this kind of decision because he's not going to make friends doing it. He also told me that people are offering to babysit his kids, go out for his groceries. He's getting lobbied day and night on it because it's the most consequential choice he's going to make. And as Brian said, he said, is he going to go historic? Maybe the first Latino, maybe the first LGBT senator. That would be maybe Robert Garcia, Long Beach mayor, who's really come up on the list. Or is it somebody who's a placeholder? He's got a million ways to go on it. I think Padilla is the one that's most mentioned, Karen Bass. Garcia, Javier Becerra is another one, the AG. And Barbara Lee has been mentioned by a number of folks, a progressive icon. She also came out first, Elex, in that USC Schwarzenegger poll this week, although most voters have no idea who any of these people are.
Yeah, more than 50% of voters had no idea who any of the people were, which was, I guess, a bad sign that they're clearly not watching The Issue Is. If only they did, they would know all of that. Thank you all for your insights. It's always a pleasure to talk to three of our favorites this week on a really big week. We end this segment with more music from John Legend. He actually performed at a big Get Out the Vote event in Philadelphia to end off the campaign with one of my favorite songs about voting, which is Wake Up Everybody. Up next, my last word about voting. Stay with us. A final word about voting. America was founded so we could escape the rule of a king. The most fundamental way to keep that democratic experiment going is free and fair elections. This month, a record number of people voted legally, and that should be celebrated. Yes, millions voted by mail because they were in the middle of a pandemic. President Trump's own scientists have been urging us for months to avoid large crowds, and both Democratic and Republican leaders around the country set up vote-by-mail options in their states. Most Democratic leaders encouraged their voters to use them. President Trump did not, saying they would be full of fraud. So it makes perfect sense that mail-in ballots are largely from Democratic voters. If there really is voter fraud, that should be investigated. But in this country, you need to show evidence. It's not like the decks are stacked against Republicans here. Most of the swing states have Republican legislatures or governors, and we know the Supreme Court is filled with Republican appointees. Show them the evidence, if there really is some. If there really isn't evidence of fraud, it is both wrong and dangerous to say so. People in this country are on the brink of riots on both sides. Our leaders have a responsibility to try and heal our divisions, not inflame them. In America, we count all legal votes, even the ones you may not agree with, and we respect the will of the people. I don't know about you, but I'm willing to wait for it until we know the final result. In that spirit, we end with this new video from Hamilton's Leslie Odom Jr. with a call for voters to be heard. I'm Elex Michaelson. Thanks for watching The Issue Is.
And I'm willing to wait for it.
Life doesn't discriminate between the sinners and the saints. Takes and takes and takes. Rise and we fall. And if there's a reason I'm still alive, and so many have died, I'm willing to wait for it.